Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Modernize to Digitize, the Need for Speed. I'm Jennifer Getz, the Editorial Director of Facility Executive Magazine, and this webinar is presented by Schneider Electric. Before we get started, I'll cover a few housekeeping items. Please note the control panel on your screen. This is where you can submit questions via the question box at any time. There will be a Q&A portion after this presentation, so please type your questions in there to send them to us. If at any time you experience a technical difficulty, please send us a message via that question section and someone on our team will answer you privately. Also, please note the orange arrow on the left side of your control panel. Clicking on that arrow will either expand or collapse the control panel. So please be sure the panel is expanded so you can access the question box. And if you are interested in continuing education credits, please note that you receive a certificate of attendance in an email from Facility Executive after this webinar. You can report to your association for the credit. Now I'll introduce your speaker. Andrew J. Tansky has been a successful business development and sales strategist for over 15 years. Since joining Schneider Electric in 2009, Andrew has held various sales management and leadership positions in field services for digital buildings of Schneider Electric. In his current role as Director of Service Offer Development for Advisors and Services, Andrew is now Product Management and Strategy for the EcoStruxure Building Advisor and Services portfolio, including standardization of sales and delivery processes for IoT building management platforms and advancing maintenance practices with remote digital services and analytics, fault detection, and diagnostics technology. Andrew, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Jen. So happy to be here, and good day to everybody listening and attending today's webinar. So as Jen said, we're here today to talk about Modernize to Digitize, the need for speed. What we're going to get into today is to talk about the modernization strategy for facilities across our infrastructure, and then how do we leverage these modern infrastructures and these modern buildings to extract digital information out of them to operate in a different mindset moving forward. Before we jump into on looking at how do we modernize and how do we digitize that information in that modern infrastructure, I thought it'd be good to take kind of a step back and look at what is happening within the industry, but also what is happening globally that is changing the mindsets of how organizations are adapting to the different challenges that they see within the world today. So if I look at this first particular graphic, there's been three main disruptions that have happened over the course of the last 3 to 5 years. And they've been disruptors for almost all of the businesses globally, not just locally and not just some subset of a particular segment. But they really are disruptions that have happened on a global scale and within all of the different segments we see within industries. The first one is around COVID. And COVID has changed the world in many ways. If I think about mainly around the way we live, the way we operate facilities, and the way we interact with facilities, it's really changed the way that we have accelerated the digitization of this infrastructure. So if we think about what COVID accelerated, facilities, when COVID did initially happen, if you weren't digitally connected, it was very difficult to run and operate a facility, to remotely maintain and look at that and look at facilities. It's also increased how we operate in a kind of a remote or hybrid work environment. It's also changed from a personal mindset of how we, simple things like how we order food, how do we interact with restaurants from digital menus now. So it's really driven a lot of change within many, many different industries. And it's really been around the acceleration of digital technologies. And we'll get more into the digitization of this world and how modernized buildings will foster a more digital environment throughout this presentation. The second big disruptor that we've seen globally is around energy volatility. Now, there are geopolitical issues that are happening on a global scale that are affecting this. And while we might not see it in certain geographical areas, energy volatility is becoming a much more wide and global requirement and a global disruptor within the industry. And then the last is around climate impacts. So if we think about climate impacts, within North America, we have seen over the last few months only different climate impacts that have interrupted the daily lives of individuals, whether it be Hurricane Ian down in the southeast and predominantly in Florida, or wildfires on the west coast, or droughts in the northeast and drought in the southwest. Climate impacts have changed the way that we have to adapt our businesses. And it's really around driving for a more sustainable infrastructure. And how do we drive more sustainability within our organizations and within the facilities and buildings that we operate and occupy on a daily basis? So these are main three disruptors. If I kind of look at the digital side of it, and we think about, in a post-COVID world, we're really seeing the advent of what we consider Internet 2.0. So if you think about Internet 1.0, it was connecting people. It was having the ability to connect with other individuals through the whole internet chain. And really, Internet 2.0 is really around connecting IoT devices and starting to connect people to machines and also connecting machines to machines. And for those who have some familiarity with this, machines like to talk a lot. They like to generate a lot of data. So how do we start to harness all of this data that is being generated, and how do we operationalize that data to operate in a different kind of mindset moving forward? So digital adoption has kind of scaled tremendously post COVID, and it's not slowing down anytime we can see in the near future. We're adding more IoT sensors, we're adding more devices, we're gathering more intelligence about our facilities, and we're increasing the amount of digitization within our facilities. From an energy perspective, this tells a story of energy consumption and the increases we have seen. Over the previous 20 years, it has been somewhat flat of the amount of energy consumption. We have been increasing, but the interesting thing about 2020 or 2000 to 2020, a lot of that energy consumption and that energy increase has been attributable to emerging markets. In fact, I believe China actually comprises about 50% of that energy usage over the last 20 years, that increase that we see. If we take a look at moving forward from 2020 all the way to 2040, one of the biggest inflections that we see within the industry is probably the largest energy revolution that we will know over the next 20 years, and it's the migration of fossil fuels to electrical vehicles. So changing the way that people operate within their vehicles, and how mass transportation operates, and moving to a more electrified environment. That's going to put a tremendous amount of strain on our resources, whether they are green resources, whether they are renewable resources, or if they are fossil resources. There is an immense need to generate electricity over the next 20 years. That's not even including, as we look at post-COVID, the digitization becoming more so dependent upon computers, data centers, the simple things like an iPhone, and then changing the way that we operate vehicles to more of an EV environment. There's going to be a strain on the energy and the electrification of our grid, of our facilities, and how we manage those facilities, and how we adapt our process and procedures moving forward. And this kind of comes together in a simple equation around, if you look at digitization is around how do we digitize our environments, which starts at modernizing our environments to gain efficiencies. How do we look at electrification for decarbonization, and how do these two go together to create a more sustainable environment and a more sustainable infrastructure for the buildings we operate, the tenants we serve, and the employees we manage within these facilities. If I take that global view and then start to boil it down to now more industry trends that are more driving different needs within buildings. We've spoke about decarbonization. It is a global kind of impact and disruptor within the industry. Sustainability, also a global disruptor, but then it starts to have more local impacts, whether they be legislative pressures for different local laws in different areas or more sustainable practices within different geographies. But it's also becoming requirements for certain organizations on how they report their financials to their shareholders, how they report their investments in sustainability to their people, their employees, their tenants. So sustainability is one part of the equation from a global disruptor, but it's also having a requirement on a local level of how do you articulate your sustainability journey to delivering for the expectations of individuals within your industry. The next one of the things that I have heard more so in the last 18 months is around labor constraints. There is a very large impact around stretched manpower, labor constraints within the industry. And we're going to get into a little bit today on when we modernize our facilities, what impact does this have on the constraints of manpower? How do we make manpower more efficient in a more IoT connected world to deliver the expectations of tenants? And that leads us right into the next thing. I mean, before COVID happened, there was an inflection point within the industry around tenant expectations and buildings themselves becoming more people centric, and tenants and employees requiring more amenities out of the facility itself in order to work and operate within that. Post COVID, this has changed dramatically. That requirement is still there from a people centricity standpoint, but now there's other levers that we start to have to look at within the tenant expectations, from indoor air quality, the health of a particular building, the sustainable journey of that particular building. So there's a lot more that goes into that equation. Obviously, supply chain challenges have hit almost every industry globally. So there's a supply chain challenge across all different building technologies, across all different segments, and it is having an impact on day-to-day operations. And this really comes down to looking at risk mitigation, and we'll talk a little bit about that today as well. Ventilation requirements, it's around the tenant expectations, and not only tenant expectations, but also whether they be recommendations from ASHRAE guidelines on indoor air quality, or the requirements of how do we ventilate our facilities a little bit better depending upon segments. Again, as we repopulate our offices, there's a different approach to return to work. There's a different method of operation and a different method of working for individuals in a post-COVID environment. There's different ways that buildings are being repopulated, and we need to adjust strategies on how we operate these facilities dependent upon how are people actually in real time reoccupying this space. And then lastly, it all revolves around digitizations. As we modernize our facilities, as we create smart buildings of the futures, how do we start to digitize all this information for efficiency? How do we start to leverage all the data that systems generate on a daily basis and make it more actionable for individuals to deliver and to mitigate all these industry trends that we see within the environment? And this leads into, this all starts then the smart building infrastructure journey. And it's really around meeting not only sustainability goals and that sustainability journey, but also how do we start to adapt around market needs? So if we start to think about 4 pillars of the smart building infrastructure, and it's broken out into the 4 key pillars: that buildings need to be sustainable as we move forward. They need to be resilient, especially with the impacts of climate change and different cybersecurity impacts, and resilient from how people reoccupy the workforce. They also need to be hyper efficient. So how do we start to harness the information and data that these facilities generate for more control from an end-to-end platform, digital platform? And then people centricity. How do we design and implement smart building technology to deliver on the expectations of an ever-changing world and the people who occupy these facilities? How do we start to deliver on certain amenities? How do we start to deliver on the requirements of a more healthy building, a more healthy environment that employees and tenants expect when they repopulate or work in these particular locations? So how does this translate into modernizing? And I think it's an important thing when we talk about smart building infrastructure. we sometimes get lost into, well, we can design a building this way, and we can design a building from a greenfield perspective in the design and construction process. But if you think about some data points, and they're not on here, but if you start to think about data points, 50 to 70% of the buildings that exist today will still exist 30 years from now, 50 years from now. So they are going to be required, the building stock we have today are going to be required to deliver on this smart building capability and this smart infrastructure to meet the changing dynamics of a global world, to meet the changing dynamics of the industry, and to meet the dynamics of a smart building itself around sustainable, resilient, hyper efficient, and people centric. So how do we start to modernize? So how do we take the current building and infrastructure we have and modernize it? So we thinking about the same kind of building blocks, we start to think about modernizing our install base or modernizing our building stock in different ways. And really, when you start to modernize, modern technology has the inherent ability to support carbon neutrality. It has an inherent ability to be more efficient, leading to more impacting labor constraints or manpower efficiency issues. We allow having more connectivity and more digitizations allows us to access to more information and to be more predictive in our analysis, which helps support speed to resolution in our facilities. But we need to do this in a cybersecure environment, right? So if we take a look at the 4 building blocks or pillars here of what are the things we need to look for when we're modernizing our infrastructure. Number one, and it's one that comes up most often, is obsolescence. Are we going to have availability of the product itself, of hardware, of software? What does the obsolescence of my current installed product look like? And how do I minimize the risk? How do I ensure that while I'm operating my facility, that I am minimizing my risk as much as possible? The second, as we start to look to modernize our infrastructure and modernize our building capabilities, how do I invest in technologies that are forward thinking, that are going to get me to the next 30 to 40 years and deliver on the changing requirements of a global perspective and also the industry? But also, how do I invest in technology that is backward capable? So I think this is very important when we think about modernizing our facilities, is investing, choosing our investments wisely around technology that is forward thinking but is backward capable, so we can mitigate some of the obsolescence, we can mitigate some of the risk, and we can preserve some of the investment that we already have installed in our facilities while maximizing the path forward. Obviously, the next one is ever present, especially in a highly digitized world, is around cybersecurity. And we're gonna touch into how this cybersecurity is changing within the industry, and how organizations and product development and service providers and software providers are stepping up to the challenge to ensure that as we modernize our facilities, we are providing a very cyber secure environment that allows us to really take the next step, the next forward leap into digitization in order to meet the goals of tomorrow. And then lastly, the building of the future. How do we now incorporate all this modern technology into some simple ecosystem that is able to be operated and maintained on a daily basis, but deliver a fully integrated, sustainable, and people-centric smart environment for tenants, for employees, for people to work in on a daily basis? So we start with the very first one around obsolescence. One thing I hear within the industry very often is we are hyper focused on the obsolescence of product, and we're hyper focused on the obsolescence of the hardware that controls different aspects in our facilities. And I'm not diminishing that. That is 100% something to be very aware of in your environment. But something that sometimes what gets overlooked in this particular obsolescence journey is, what about the software that actually supports this technology? And what is the journey of that software obsolescence on a Microsoft? And I just happen to pick Microsoft here because it does operate a lot of the computer-based systems within the industries. But we have to be cognizant, and this is very important, that while hardware obsolescence and field hardware obsolescence is vital, and we have to make sure we minimize that risk, it's also important to look at what risks are also being exposed from a software level and a software layer. Are we able on our platforms, are we able to run the most current versions of Microsoft Windows Server or database systems? Are we on the latest version of antivirus? Do we have the ability to code to the latest version of these different software platforms that create a more secure environment from a cyber perspective? So when we think about obsolescence, it is important to look at this in a 360 view of not only the hardware that operates the facility on a daily basis, but also what is the obsolescence planning around the software that supports the hardware in the field. The last thing here when we talk about obsolescence, and this gets more into the hardware side of it, replacing hardware and retrofitting hardware is expensive. There's no two ways around it. There is a cost to retrofitting facilities. So when we start to think about it, and we'll transition into the next slide in a second that talks a little bit more about how do we plan around this, the cost to retrofitting hardware in the field is very expensive, not only from a hardware perspective of actually replacing the hardware, but the cabling infrastructure that must be installed to support that new hardware. But also, if it's a existing facility that is occupied, how do we then retrofit that particular space with minimal intrusion to the occupants? So there's a lot that goes into this retrofitting. And as we modernize, we need to be cognizant of how do we kind of balance these worlds, right? So when we look at this in this balancing act, it really gets into then now the forward capable or the forward thinking, backward capable approach, and investing in technologies and providers that approach this in that kind of mindset. So when we think about a modernization approach to infrastructure, there's kind of a 1, 2, 3 approach that we've seen work within this industry and work within this space. One being around to really start to think about how do we plan this in phases? How do we look at our budget cycles? How do we look at our occupant schedules and our occupancy of different areas and the facility strategy overall? And how do we start to plan modernization capability in a very phased approach? It could be starting at a software approach. How do we modernize software so that we are, from a cybersecurity perspective, protected? Then how do we plan for the field hardware and migrate that to the latest platform? And then how do we look at it from a cabling infrastructure while minimizing the occupant disruption and fitting it into the overall facility strategy of modernizing the facility? The last one is around preserving the investment. And this is where it is important when we look at this to make sure that we are investing in technologies that are backward compatible. There have been significant investments within the industry in building systems and systems that operate our facilities on a daily basis. We want to preserve that investment for as long as we possibly can. It might not last forever, and there is an obsolescence risk, but how do we minimize that risk while maximizing our potential? And that's where this is an important aspect of this, is when we start to plan a modern approach, it is important that we select and invest in technologies and capabilities that not only bring us into the future and set the groundwork for the next 20, 30, 40 years, but also provide us a soft landing of the legacy technology that is backward capable. It can bring it along on the journey and minimize that obsolescence risk. And then that way, when we deploy it, it becomes a cost-effective, future-ready, scalable, secure, resilient, digitized end-to-end architecture. Whether it's IP-based, whether it's RS-485 based, whether it's wireless IoT based, having the ability to now operate and deploy a cost-effective, future-capable, secure, scalable, resilient solution. So when we think about modernizing it, it is a relatively simple approach, but the one thing I would focus on here is that as we modernize our facilities, it is important that where we make investments, that we have the flexibility to be forward thinking but backward capable. I'm going to transition now to that third pillar when we look at modernizing facilities is around cybersecurity, especially as we become more digital in our environments, whether between IoT technology, between wireless technology, IP-based communication. It is important to look at how do we manage the cyber vulnerabilities and how do we look at cybersecurity within these facilities moving forward. Obviously, as we become more digital, there's more of an inherent risk from a cyber perspective. So again, we love to put things into fours. We kind of block this into kind of four unique categories. The first one, and this goes more to technology providers. It is important as we modernize our facilities that we are selecting and investing in technologies that are supported through a secure development lifecycle policy. So what does that mean? What that means is that the technology provider, the technology developer, the IoT provider, that hardware software manufacturer has put process and procedures in place to ensure that they're delivering products and solutions to the industry that have a built-in security measurements from concept to delivery. So as they design these offers and they design these technologies and solutions, that cybersecurity is inherent in all of the design lifecycle. So it becomes part of the lifecycle of the product, offer, technology, solution inherently, that it's not an afterthought of looking at a third-party system to manage the cyber perspective of it. The next one is around data protection. We have come a very long way in short amount of time around data protection. Newer modern technologies, as we implement them, they become inherently improved from an encryption standpoint. There's dedicated certificates to make sure that anything you put on a network is supposed to be there and it's authenticated by something else on the network. So we're developing and designing solutions and implementing solutions in a more cyber aware environment, so that from a digital standpoint, as we implement new technologies, that they're not only encrypted, but they also are authenticated so that they're supposed to be on that platform or in that infrastructure. And then from a buildings perspective, and this is more dedicated to, I would say, the very hard into the building side of it and building operation, is around BACnet Secure Connect, whether it's in deploying BACnet Secure Connect, but now getting down to the data transmission of the mechanical side of the house to ensure that the data transmission from field hardware to central server is encrypted and secure along that journey. So as we implement more IP technology on HVAC systems within our facilities, or if the lighting systems run on BACnet, or if the different building technologies happen to utilize the BACnet protocol, that we're ensuring that we have a mechanism now to be securely connecting that traffic end to end. The user experience, implementation of password policies, secure email, roles-based access control, and really starting to allow, as we get into a more digital environment, is to ensure that we are from a data protection and user experience, that we are authenticating users specifically to allow them access to the platforms. And then that leads into the secure credentials. Newer technologies are more apt to be very cohesively integrated with IT organizations within facilities. So how do we start to combine the two departments and look at different departments to work together? So one is from an Active Directory or user authentication. If they're able to access the IP network from an IT perspective, they should be able to maybe access the building side of the facility. So having the availability of secure credentials. These technologies on a modern facility make the facility inherently more cyber secure. It allows us to deliver a much more digital environment, but ensuring that we're delivering a more secure and more rapidly deployed secure environment for all the entities and minimizing the risk from a cyber perspective. Lastly, when all of this goes together, it then starts to, well, what does the modernized building system look like? I'm not going to touch on all these points, but you'll start to see common themes here. As we modernize the building systems, we start to have the availability to manage energy differently. So if we think back to the global impacts around energy volatility, sustainability, having the ability to harness more information from modernized buildings, we can start to manage our energy portfolios within the facilities a little bit differently. We can start to reduce downtime, so we can start to provide a better occupant experience. We can also improve the occupant experience. The more connectivity we have in facilities, the more control and the more capabilities and amenities we can provide to employees, we can provide to tenants, we can just provide on an overall perspective. Modernized buildings, we just went over this, they are inherently more cyber secure. There's more encryption, there's more capabilities of protecting data with that environment. And then lastly, we have the availability now in modern buildings to connect the entire building ecosystem. We can start to leverage inherent integrations of building technologies. So now we can look at card access control systems, and we can look at building operation systems. We can look at lighting control systems. We can now integrate all of them, and we can start to make the cohesive technologies start to talk to each other. This goes back to machine talking. And how do we get machine to machine to talk for better efficiency and better digitization? One thing I will say here is, as we modernize our building infrastructure, we do see inherent benefits to the owner operator, and inherent benefits to the system integrators, to inherent benefits to the people who occupy the facilities. One thing though is modern buildings generate an immense amount of data. So as we see more IoT devices, as we see more modern IP infrastructure, more wireless technology, and more modern facilities, these buildings generate an exorbitant amount of data. Data is very good. So, but what do we do with that data? And that goes now, once we modernize, how do we then digitize? So when we look at the digitization of that modern facility, it goes into four key tenets, and it's not, this is four key tenets of kind of day two operations, right? And the continuously operating of a facility, a modern facility in a digitized world. So the first one is around digital service. How do we start to utilize the real-time data, the conditions of the building, to deliver services within the facility differently? How do we utilize the real-time data to increase the speed to resolution? And how do we utilize that real-time digital data to increase the effectiveness of our labor? Labor is definitely being constrained, so how do we arm them to utilize this data differently? The digital healthy environment. How do we now take this modern infrastructure, and how do we dissect and analyze all of the data around how people actually interact with the facility? How are employees, how are tenants repopulating the facility in the return to work that we're seeing now? And how, when they repopulate, how is it changing the health parameters of that facility differently in real time? Digital sustainability. Now, how do we utilize all of this real-time data in a 360 view of sustainability and carbon impact? Not only from an energy consumption standpoint, but also how do we start to show the sustainability journey of our services that we deliver? How do we, when we start to fix items within a facility that previously were maybe wasting energy, how do we turn that action into the sustainable and decarbonization impact for an organization? And then the last, around digital data. How do we empower the human element? So this goes back to something I said in the very beginning. Internet 2.0, people connecting to machines, machines connecting to machines. How do we utilize this data that's being generated to empower the human element that still operates and populates our facilities. So if we take a look first at digital service, how do we turn data into action? So the first is connecting. How do we get the data out of the systems? It could be via cloud-based technologies, it could be via premise-based technologies, but it's essentially taking information from these modern buildings and modeling it. When I say model it, it could be a digital twin, it could be modeling from a set of rules, but how do we start to model our systems of how the buildings are supposed to operate versus what real-time information is telling us? When we can model it and inject real-time information, we can start to develop a service journey for service providers in these facilities. We can start to view in a digital twin environment, how is the building supposed to operate versus what is real-time information telling us? And we can start providing faults, diagnostics to enable speed to resolution and labor efficiency. We can now pinpoint problems that are happening in real time. We can provide the root cause of why this is happening. And we can also start to visualize this in how much utility are we wasting by these faults? What's the impact of my energy and sustainability journey? What's the impact of the maintenance and life cycle of my equipment? And what's the impact of the comfort of the people who are being served by these different pieces of equipment? So the digital service aspect is taking the data and turning it into action. The digital environments, as we saw on a previous slide, it's how do we start to take the information of how people repopulate the office spaces and to better understand, do we have our spaces correct? Are our spaces, are we overcrowded? If we go back to social distancing requirements into the future, or if there's fire issues or fire code issues, modern buildings have the inherent ability to understand how people are moving within a facility. So how can we start to reduce overcrowding in a particular space? How do we right size our space? There's a very great unknown of how entities are going to repopulate the workplace. Are we going to be 100% occupied again? Are we going to have all the employees back every single day of the week? Or does Tuesday become the day that 80% of our workforce comes back? Or is it Tuesday through Thursday? There's great unknown through all of the industries and all of the different segments out there of how we're going to repopulate spaces into the future and how work habits are going to change into the future. Modernized buildings and having the ability to collect data, we have the inherent ability to start understanding and analyzing how are our spaces being utilized. When we understand how our spaces are being utilized, you can start to adapt your office layouts. Do people maybe populate this conference room more so than this particular workspace? And you can start to adapt your office space to deliver amenities that are behavioral to the employees who actually occupy them. You can also view it on right sizing your space. Do we have too much square footage? Do we not have enough square footage? Is this square footage better to be repurposed as something else? The digital environments also goes to, as we understand how people interact with the space, we can also understand, are we delivering the proper healthy building requirements for that space? Whether it's optimal humidity, whether it's CO2, if there's large populations of individuals in conference rooms, are we worried about CO2 in that space? Are we maintaining proper air circulation? Are we monitoring, measuring volatile organic compounds? Can we utilize this kind of volatile organic compound detection for different ways to service it from a trash mitigation, whether bathroom cleanings, things like that? So how do we take the information of how people repopulate and interact with their space, and how do we crunch that data, analyze it for different outcomes within the modernized building? From a digital sustainability standpoint, this goes into now turning actions taken by individuals or providers or service people and turning it into the impact of the sustainability journey of organizations. So when we can start to, and this kind of directly correlates to digital service, as we take the digital data from facilities and we start to analyze and to perform analytics on it, and provide more insight into real-time conditions of the facility, we can now not only maximize our labor efficiency, and also have a speed to resolution, we can also start to turn actions into sustainability. So if we start to take a look at actions, if we start to fix items, when I'll focus here on HVAC side of the house for a second, if we fix air handling units that may be simultaneously heating and cooling, if we fix that, there is an energy impact obviously to fixing that, but there's also there's a sustainability impact. There's a decarbonization impact by fixing that. So when we look at digital sustainability, is having the inherent ability to understand, as we service our facilities moving forward, what impact do those actions that have been taken translate into sustainability in an effort to decarbonize the overall portfolio of our facilities. And then lastly, digital data. And this is around, how do we leverage all of this digital data, whether it's digital service, whether it's digital environments, whether it's digital sustainability, digital twins, a lot of digital words out there. But one of the most important aspects of this is we can generate all of the data in the world, and buildings are very good at generating data. Machines are very good at generating data, but there's a human element to it. That human element cannot be overlooked. And that human element is to ensure that we're taking all of this data and we're turning it into action. The data is business intelligence. The data is actionable insight to real-time conditions of the facility. But we need to ensure that we're leveraging the digital capability to empower the human element, to empower the workforce. When we see those two combined together, that's when we can maximize the digital advantage of efficiency. We can have an impact on the overall energy portfolio of our facilities, and we can have a tremendous impact on the sustainable journey of these facilities as well. So it's important when we look at digitization and generating large amounts of data, it is just data unless there's a human element that is empowered to leverage that data and deliver actionable intelligence and actionable insights and actions out on in the field to deliver on what the data is telling us. So big question here, is your building modernized and digitized ready? So there could be different ways that you may view this in next steps. Obviously, Schneider Electric is a large entity within this facility. We're more than willing to help. But when you sit and plan to ensure that your buildings are modernized to digitize ready, there's a few different things to look at. You can assess how you currently maintain your facility. What are your costs in maintaining your facility? Where do you spend your operating budgets mainly in your facility? And how will modernizing and digitizing that have an impact on those different costs? Assess your budgets and feasibility, and plan in phases. So how do you attack this so that you can work within a budget, you can plan it in phases? How do you select technology partners that are forward thinking but backward capable? And how do you engineer that approach, that plans phased approach, to deliver on a modern building that will enable the digitization and efficiencies that can be gained with that environment? And as we pause for questions and we come to the conclusion here, I will say, from a Schneider Electric perspective, it is our mission to be your digital partner for sustainability and efficiency. With that, I would like to thank every single person who joined today's webinar. Hopefully, there was great content here. We can start the modernization journey and digitization journey for a more sustainable future together. And again, I thank you for your time, and your dedication today. And I guess, Jen, I'll open up to questions if there are any.
Perfect. Thank you, Andrew, for this presentation, and thank you to all attendees for sending in questions. We'll now, as Andrew said, have some Q&A to address the questions that you've sent in, and please continue to submit any questions that you may have. Okay, so to get started, can you talk through how modernizing would help stretch manpower?
So stretch manpower, I will say, in my journey within this industry over the years, Over the last 4 to 5 years, labor constraints, I would say pre-COVID labor constraints were definitely on the minds of a lot of individuals. Post-COVID, it's been accelerated. It is a disruption within the industry. And when we look at modernizing facilities, it's one thing to modernize a facility. And as we showed as we talked through in this webinar, when you modernize a facility, you are going to generate an exorbitant amount of data. That data is gold. That data is your building and your infrastructure talking to you. And it's an important thing to look at as your building talks to you, to have the ability to digitize that information and turn it into recommendations and turn it into root cause analysis without having to expend labor to go look for that particular root cause analysis, I think brings us to a labor efficiency we have not seen previously. So we no longer have to sit individuals in front of a computer looking for the problem. We no longer have to sit individuals out in the field looking for the problem. Our buildings are generating the problem for us. So when we look at a modernized building, this data is absolute gold. And when we digitize that data, we go back to empowering the human elements. We can become way more efficient in how we deliver our services on a day-to-day basis, which enable us to really start to minimize the impact that labor constraints have within our facilities.
Great, great. Another question we have here is, I'm intentionally, quote unquote, not connected now for security reasons. How do you make sure your hardware is cyber secure?
Excellent question. And I will say that the disruption of COVID has accelerated this requirement. Um, when we look at connectivity and we looked at the cybersecurity journey that we spoke about in this webinar, it is important that when you look at technology partners and you look at technology itself, that you are aligning yourself with organizations, providers, equipment manufacturers, to where cybersecurity is one of their core tenets. It is important as we connect more devices, and it will inherently be required to connect more devices and more IoT infrastructure. It is important that you look at the particular technology provider and to understand what is their secure lifecycle development. It should be cybersecurity should be embedded in their secure development process. They should be approaching designs of their systems. They should be approaching designs of their offers with a cyber first mentality to ensure that information is encrypted, end-to-end encrypted, that authentication is a requirement for connections to networks, and to ensure that in their life cycle and their life cycle plan that they continuously monitor and maintain their cyber proactive capabilities within their products.
Perfect. Um, Another question we have here is, can you talk through why it is more expensive to retrofit old hardware?
So when we look at old hardware and legacy hardware, it really becomes, excuse me for 1 second, it really becomes twofold. Well, number one is with the new technologies, there is a cabling impact. So when we look at cabling of the infrastructure, you might require, as you implement new technologies, it might require more IP-based connectivity, which can impact your overall wiring your facility, which can be costly. It's also, from a cost perspective, you might have a existing space that you want to retrofit. So if you look at existing spaces, there might be occupants within that facility that you're going to need to work around. So you might have to schedule on overtime. You might have to schedule on weekends. You have to kind of schedule around that particular occupant so you don't interrupt their daily workflows. So when you take a look at retrofitting hardware, you do have the inherent ability to become very disruptive to the tenants or the occupants or the employees of that particular facility. So if you can find a technology partner that is backward capable, you can preserve some of that investment. It's not going to maybe operate forever, but you can plan accordingly so that it's not a disruption within that environment.
Perfect. Thank you so much. I believe we have time for one or two more questions. So I will ask one more. What do I need to consider before evaluating budget? Who should I involve?
So when you evaluate the budget, it's important to evaluate this in a few different ways. Number one, from a budgetary standpoint, it's important to involve your value chain. And to get the value chain involved early to understand their capabilities within delivering the technology, whether it's equipment manufacturers, system integrators, service providers, to seek their input so that you are designing your facility in the most efficient way and leveraging as much technology capability you have. The other one I will say is, as you saw within this presentation in this webinar, is there's much more interconnectivity to the IT side of the house. So it's important to also connect and to leverage the IT departments within organizations because you can leverage more of their capability and their know-how in delivering this more modern and digital environments. And then lastly, I will say, and hopefully it came through this presentation, as you modernize and digitize facilities, there's an inherent ability to go on a sustainability journey and a decarbonization journey. So when you're looking at also including in this budget cycle is what is your organizational's sustainability journey? How does this modern infrastructure fit into that sustainability journey? And how do you work together in the budgetary life cycle of your facility as you modernize it?
Perfect. Thank you so much, Andrew. It looks like we are out of time. Thank you, Andrew, for this presentation today. And thank you again to Schneider Electric for sponsoring this webinar. If you asked a question and it wasn't able to be answered today, someone on our team will answer you privately. A recording from today's session will be made available on our magazine's website, facilityexecutive.com. Thank you and have a great afternoon.